Welcome to Lecture 20, in which we are going to examine verbal roots and learn the future tense patterns 2 to 4. In this lecture, you are going to learn about two things. Firstly, you will learn about verbal roots and stems. The tense stem of each verb form is built on a verbal root. Learning the roots is the key to learning verbs. Secondly, you are going to learn patterns 2 to 4 of the future tense. In the previous lecture we covered pattern 1, which is by far the most common. Here you will learn how Greek verbs that form patterns 2, 3 and 4 futures form the future tense. Section 1. Verbal roots and stems. Let us begin with some critical definitions. The root of a verb is its most basic form. The stem of a verb is its most basic form in a particular tense. I'll say that again. The root of a verb is its most basic form. The stem is the most basic form of the verb in a particular tense. Understanding the root and stem ideas is absolutely critical to mastering the Greek verbal system. Please make sure that you understand this distinction. The root, most basic form, the stem, most basic form in a particular tense. This diagram shows how it works. We have the verbal root as the most basic form, and from that root we derive the present tense stem, the future tense stem, the aorist tense stem, and so forth. The various tense stems are formed from the verbal root. A tense stem is often identical to the root, but sometimes the root is modified to form the tense stem. The stem that is most often modified is the present tense stem. This is important because the form that we learn in the dictionary is the present tense form. So when you learn the dictionary form, you're often learning a modified root. A critical aid to mastering Greek verbs and vocabulary is that when you learn a verb, you should also learn the verbal root, because if you know the root, it's easy to identify the other stems, whereas if you only know the present tense form that you see in the dictionary, you often do not recognize some of the other forms. The root li is a good example of a root that remains unchanged as the stem for each of the tenses. The diagram above shows that the root li is also the tense stem for the present, future, and aorist tenses. So when you see lio, you can see the root li. Similarly, liso and elisa all contain an unchanged root li. The reason actually that we use the verb li for memorizing Greek verbs is partly that it's a really short one, but also partly because it is such a constant and stable verb. In other words, the root li is easy to recognize and remains unchanged in each of the tense stems. Here is another example using the root val, veta, aleph, lambda. In this case, the root is val. The root val is also the tense stem for the future, you can see valo, and for the aorist, evala. But a modified form of val serves as the tense stem for the present tense, it is valo. Notice the duplicated lambda. In this instance, the modification is a doubling of the stem letter lambda. So if you had learned the present tense valo as the main form of the verb, it would be slightly more difficult to recognize the future and aorist forms which lose a lambda. But if you had learned the root is val, then it's easy to recognize that the present tense stem has been modified slightly. Remember, the tense stem most likely to be modified is in fact the present tense stem. One more example. Here we have the root gno. The root gno remains intact as the tense stem for the future, gnoso, and for the aorist tenses. egnon in the case of the aorist. But it's undergone massive changes to form the present tense stem, which is actually ginosk. The changes here are the addition of gi in the front, something known as reduplication, and the addition of the letters sigma kappa towards the end of the stem. Once again, if you had learned the root as gno, it's easy to recognize the future gnoso and the aorist egnon, whereas if you had only learned the present tense dictionary form ginosko, it might be difficult to recognize some of the tenses that are built on the root itself. Remember, therefore, that the best way to learn the verbs is to memorize the verbal root as the most basic form of each verb and master how each tense modifies it to build its tense stem. Then learn how the forms are built from the tense stem. If you do it this way, you will find that the amount of things you need to memorize and learn by rote is dramatically reduced. You will also find it much easier to recognize unfamiliar forms of verbs because you familiarized yourselves with roots and how various stems and forms are built from those roots. We commend this to you as by far the best way to learn the verbs. It requires a little bit of extra work up front, but you reap huge dividends down the road. So remember, memorize the verbal root as the most basic form of each verb and master how each tense modifies it to build its tense stem. Section 2. The future tense, patterns 2 to 4. In the previous lecture, we saw that most Greek verbs form their future tense by adding the tense formative sigma to the verbal root. We called that pattern 1. It is by far the most common way that the future is formed. However, there are 3 other patterns that you need to recognize. We are going to turn our attention to each of those patterns, which we call patterns 2 to 4. Pattern 2, different roots. Pattern 2 futures are built on completely different roots. Yes, that's right. Some verbs use completely different roots to form the present and future tenses. Let's look at a few examples of those. Firstly, the verb erchome, I come. This is the present tense. Erchome, I come. The stem and also the root is erch, erch. However, when you learn erchome, you also learn that its future is elephsome, I will come, elephsome. The future tense root and stem is eleph, eleph. So the present tense stem is erch and the future tense stem is eleph. In other words, we have completely different roots and thus completely different stems for the present and future tenses. Another example is the verb orao, I see. Orao, I see. The present tense stem and root is ora, ora. But the future is opsome, opsome, I will see. Now, for opsome, the stem, which is also the root, is op. Clearly, ora and op are not modified forms of each other, they are completely different roots. One last example, a very common one in the New Testament, the verb lego, I say, lego, I say. The stem obviously is leg and the root is leg. The future, however, is ero, I will say, ero, I will say. Yeah, we can see that the stem and root is er. So the present tense root, leg, the future tense root, er, they are completely different. So some verbs, what we call pattern 2, use completely different roots to form the present and the future tenses. Pattern 3, liquid roots. What are liquid verbs? Liquid verbs are verbs that have stems ending in one of 4 consonants: lambda, mi, ni, or rho. So a liquid verb has a stem that ends in lambda, mi, ni, or rho. There are two critical differences between liquid roots and other roots. Firstly, the present and future tense stems often differ slightly. There will be some difference between the stem in the present and future tense. And more importantly, for the formation of the future tense formative for liquid verbs is epsilon sigma instead of just sigma. That's really important. The future tense formative for liquid verbs is epsilon sigma instead of just sigma, as it is for the pattern 1 verbs. So liquid verbs have stems ending in lambda, min, ni, or rho, and they take epsilon sigma as their tense formative for the future. This chart shows how the future active form of a liquid verb is formed. We are using the root men. We add the future tense formative, epsilon sigma, the connecting vowel omicron, and then the primary active personal endings. Then something important happens. Intervocalic sigma drops out. The epsilon from the tense formative epsilon sigma remains, and it will contract with the connecting vowel. In the example given, epsilon and omicron contract to form oo. Thus we have menesomen, we lose the sigma, it becomes meneomen, and then it contracts to form menumen. So the final form of the future would be menumen, we will remain. The future middle of liquid verbs is built exactly the same way, except of course that we would use the primary passive instead of active personal endings. Once again, we would have the future tense stem, in this instance men. We add the future tense formative. Remember, for liquid verbs it's epsilon sigma, the appropriate connecting vowel, in the example omicron, and then the primary passive personal ending, in the example metha. Once again, intervocalic sigma drops out. The remaining epsilon from the tense formative contracts with the connecting vowel. In the example given, epsilon omicron contracts to oo. Thus, in a sense, we had menesometha, which became meneometha, which became menumetha. We will remain for ourselves. And here are the paradigms for the future active indicative and the future middle indicative of liquid verbs. We have, talking of the actives, meno, menis, meni, menumen, menite, menusin. And the middles, menume, mene, menite, menumetha, meniste, menunte. Study the paradigms closely, noting that the tense formative is epsilon sigma, and that after the intervocalic sigma drops out, there's a contraction. Now, the liquid future forms look very similar to present indicative forms of ordinary verbs. However, take note of two things. Firstly, notice the liquid consonant. Also notice the accent on the contracted syllable. These are the two clues that it's a liquid future rather than a normal present form. The contractions in a liquid verb cause it to look similar to a present contract form. This begs the question, how can we distinguish a liquid future from a present contract verb? There are two clues. Firstly, you will have memorized the lexical form. Therefore, you will know that menis, for instance, is from meno and not from meneo. This would be a clue that it's a liquid future and not a contract verb. In other words, when you memorize verbs, you memorize which ones are contract verbs. And if you've done that well, it's never a problem to recognize which ones are contract presents and which ones are liquid futures. But there's also a second clue. You will notice that the final stem letter is a liquid consonant. Therefore, in our example, menis must be a liquid future. If the final stem vowel were not a liquid, it cannot be a liquid future, and you must be looking at a present contract form. Since the tense formative sigma which is often the key to recognizing an ordinary future form, drops out in liquid futures. The present tense and future tense of most liquid verbs look similar. This begs another question. How can we distinguish a present liquid form from a future liquid form? Once again, there are two clues. Firstly, the accents will be different. The liquid futures typically have a circumflex on the contracted syllable. That circumflex is a key to recognizing them as liquid futures. Secondly, the connections will be different. Liquid futures have contractions where you see the connecting vowel. Presents do not. So if the connecting vowel reflects as a contraction and you know that it's not a contract verb, you must be looking at a future form. Conversely, if there isn't a contraction or there isn't a circumflex over the contracted syllable, then you're probably looking at a present tense form. There is one last thing that you need to know about liquid verbs. Many liquid verbs change or modify their roots to form their present tense stems. The common changes are either doubling a letter or adding an iota. Let's look at a few examples of modified roots for liquid verbs. For instance, the verb apostello, I send. The root is apostel. Notice that in the root part stel, the lambda is doubled in the present tense, but it would not be doubled in other tenses. We've already looked at balo, valo, I throw or I cast. Once again, we see a doubled lambda in the present tense stem, but the root has only one lambda. Next, ero, I raise. Ero. In the present tense, it's alpha iota rho that is the stem, but an iota has been added. The root is in fact simply r. Next, egiro, I raise up. The present tense stem is egir. Notice epsilon iota in the middle consonant. But the root is simply eger. Once again, an iota has been added to the root to form the present tense stem. And lastly, apoktino, I kill. The actual root is simply kappa, tau, epsilon, ni. But we've added an iota to get ktin. You hear the iota that's been added? So commonly, liquid verbs will modify their roots to form their present tense stems. The two most common modifications are doubling a letter or adding an iota. This is also a key diagnostic to help you distinguish the present and future forms of liquid verbs. Pattern 4. Modified roots. As we've already noted, the present tense is the most irregular tense because many verbs modify their root to form their present tense. This is why we encourage you to learn the roots and recognize the patterns of modification that are used to form the present tense. In other words, there are certain regular modifications that take place. Or, to put it in other language, standard ways that Greek will modify a verbal root to form a present tense stem. Now, what does this have to do with learning to recognize future tenses? Well, it's very straightforward. In these cases, the future tense will be built on the verbal root. So if you know the root, it'll be easy to recognize the future tense form. However, because the present tense stem has been modified, you may not recognize that root relates to a word that you've memorized because you've memorized it in a slightly different form. However, if you know the standard patterns of modification to form the present tense stem, then it's easy to recognize the root when you see it. Let's take a look at some of the regular modifications that are used to form present tense stems. The first group consists of stems ending in iso or azo in the lexicon. Lexical forms ending in either iso or azo usually have roots that end in a dental. Remember, dentals are tav, delta, or theta. Other tenses are formed regularly from the root, but the present tense is built on a modified root. One example is the verb baptizo, I baptize. The root is in fact baptid, baptid. When we form the future, we simply add the tense formative sigma and the endings to the root baptid. So we would end up with baptizo. If you had learned this pattern, it would be easy to decipher what's going on. The second category of regular adjustments in forming the present tense relates to verbs that end in aso, aso. By end in, I mean end in the dictionary. So lexical forms ending in aso tend to have roots ending in a vela. The velas, if you recall, are kappa, gamma, and chi. Other tenses are formed regularly from the root. One example is the verb tarasso, tarasso. Its root is actually tarach. If we take the root tarach, we can see that the future taraxo is formed regularly by adding the tense formative sigma and the personal endings. Remember then, verbal stems ending in izo or azo have roots that end in a dental, and verbal stems ending in aso have roots that end in a vela. Finally, some verbs add the letters iota, sigma kappa, or a combination of them, iota sigma kappa, to their roots to form the present tense. A couple of examples will illustrate the idea. Consider the root ar, ar. It forms its present tense by adding iota, so the present tense stem becomes er or air. The root gno, which we looked at earlier, forms its present tense stem by adding, amongst other things, sigma kappa. Thus we get ginosk, ginosk. The root apothan forms its present tense stem by adding sigma kappa as well. So we go from apothan to apothnesk. Indeed, there are other changes in ginosk and apothnesk, but if you recognize that many verbs add sigma kappa and sometimes an iota as well somewhere in the mix, then you're well on your way to recognizing forms that have unusual present tense stems with all of these modifications, and you will mostly be able to figure out the root from seeing other tense forms. So some verbs add the letters iota, sigma kappa, or a combination iota sigma kappa to their roots to form their present tense stems. This is the end of lecture 20.